Hey everybody, Graham here. This is part 3 of my series on Dianetics, wherein I read and summarize Dianetics so that you don't have to. I hope people are still interested in this now that the Danny Masterson trial is in limbo for at least a little while. We still don't know if the DA is going to refile the charges or not after the mistrial. But I'm still interested, so I'm going to keep going. In this installment, we are going to tackle chapters 3, 4, and 5. Chapter 3 is the goal of man. Chapter 4 is the 4 dynamics. And chapter 5 is a summary of the first 4 chapters. So we'll be going through that, and let's just dive right in. Let's go ahead and pull this up. Bam. Okay. So here we are with the goal of man. The goal of man, the lowest common denominators of all his activities, the dynamic principle of his existence. Let me just pause here for a second. Hubbard uses the term dynamic a lot, and I'm not always sure what he means by it. My understanding of the word dynamic is that it's something that changes, particularly over time. He seems to use it that way, but also in a way that makes it sound more like a synonym for principle, but we're just going to go with it. Okay. So, the dynamic principle of his existence has long been sought. Well, I suppose that's true. Should such an answer be discovered, it is inevitable that from it many answers would flow. It would explain all phenomena of behavior. It would lead towards a solution of man's major problems, and most of all, it should be workable. So one of the things that I do like about Hubbard's writing is that I do like that he gives you a topic sentence or, a topic paragraph right up front. He tells you what he's going to discuss in this. What I don't like about his writing is the fact that he is very prone to sort of making claims that are arguable as if, and just stating them as if they were things that everybody knows. In particular, this bit, it would explain all phenomena of behavior, so that if we knew the goal of man in general, not the goal of a man, the goal of mankind, then we could explain everything that everybody does. Now, that assumes a level of rationality and determinism that I'm not prepared to grant. I don't know if attitudes about this were different in the late 40s than they are now, but I think that people do plenty of things that are irrational, inexplicable, and I don't think this is all down to, neuroses. I think that different people's brains work differently, and you can simply be different from other people. I think people are basically the same in terms of our basic nature and function, but when it comes to our higher functions and the things that motivate our behavior, I think we can be very different. We may all be motivated by hunger, but you can be a vegan or you can eat nothing but Twinkies to satisfy your hunger. So I think this is, like I said, I think this overestimates the uniformity of people's minds and people's outlooks on life. But anyway, we'll move on. Time, space, energy, and life have a single denominator in common. As an analogy, it could be considered that time, space, energy, and life began at some point of origin and were commanded to continue to some nearly infinite destination. They were told nothing but what to do. They obey a single order, and that order is survive. The dynamic principle of existence is survival. The goal of life can be considered to be infinite survival. Man as a life form can be demonstrated to obey in all his actions and purposes the one command, survive. It is not a new thought that man is surviving. It is a new thought that man is motivated only by survival. That his single goal is survival does not mean that he is the optimum survival mechanism which life has attained or will develop. The goal of the dinosaur was also survival, and the dinosaur isn't extant anymore. So, basically, the survival instinct is everything. Everything that you do, everything that you think, every goal that you have, so on and so forth, is pushing towards survival. And this is not just true of humanity, this is true of time, space, energy, and life. So pretty much everything. The goal of time is survival. The goal of space is survival. The goal of energy is survival. The goal of life, which would include all plants, animals, insects, whatever, is survival. I think this overstates it quite a bit. I mean, I do think that the survival instinct is pretty fundamental to most living organisms. I don't know about inanimate matter and energy, but I mean, I do think the survival instinct is a thing, but I don't think it's everything. And Hubbard is going to try to expand it into everything. And it's kind of interesting how he does this, but just stick with me here and we'll see it. Here's one I didn't highlight this, but this is kind of interesting here. Obedience to this command, survive, does not mean that every attempt to obey is uniformly successful. Changing environment, mutation, many other things militate against any one organism attaining infallible survival techniques or form. This is actually nice to see because he's saying that he is acknowledging that there are different environments that produce different results and that different survival strategies are required in different situations, which is refreshingly non-reductive for Hubbard. This is important since it has been poorly considered in the past that a set of survival characteristics in one species would not be survival characteristics in another. Well, I don't know what the state of evolutionary theory was in the late 40s, but I mean, I think this is a pretty common understanding right now. I mean, I don't know. That doesn't seem like a particularly profound statement to me. But moving on. The methods of survival can be summed under the headings of food protection, both defensive and offensive, and procreation. Once survival was isolated as the only dynamic of a life form which would explain all of its activities, it was necessary to study further the action of survival. So, I think what he's saying here is that if you look at any activity, you can bring it back to survival, and that's the only thing that you can bring it back uniformly. Now, I highlighted this next bit here in a different color because he's talking about how he uses language, and I think it's kind of an important thing to look at. So let me read this bit. In order to establish nomenclature in Dianetics, which would not be too complex for the purpose, words normally considered as adjectives or verbs have occasionally been pressed into service as nouns. This has been done on the valid principle that existing terminology, meaning so many different things, could not be used by Dianetics without making it necessary to explain away old meanings to bring forth a new. This is something that you see from time to time in academic literature and other things of this nature. I'm thinking of a music theory book I read once where the author refused to use terms like consonant and dissonant, which are very common terms in music, and tried to replace them with the terms ingoing tonal gravity and outgoing tonal gravity, because he felt that the words consonant and dissonant had too many implications that he didn't want to bring in. So it's not unusual for people to do this, but I think Hubbard kind of goes to an extreme with it. But it is worth noting that he is giving you a warning up front that there's going to be jargon, and I think that's kind of considerate of him. So let's move on. Let's keep going. As will be seen in the accompanying graph. Now, I don't know if it's a feature of this particular PDF or not, but I have not found a graph in here. So I don't know if there was an actual graph or if he's just describing a graph. But I haven't run across it yet. At least it's not there through the end of chapter 5. So keep that in mind, that when I talk about the graph, I'm not going to be able to show you the graph. A spectrum of life has been conceived to span from zero of death or extinction towards the infinity of potential immortality. So we have a spectrum. 0 is death. Immortality is infinity. I don't know if this is meant to be the X or the Y axis at this point. The thrust of survival is away from death and toward immortality. All right, I'll buy that. The urge is away from death, which is a repelling force, and towards immortality, which has an attracting force. The attracting force is pleasure. The repelling force is pain. So this is a very sort of behaviorist, sort of Skinner-esque way of looking at human motivation here. Oh, from left to right could be graph the years. Okay, so time is the x-axis, and this death versus survival is the y-axis. So that's what our graph would look like. If we wished to make this graph for a life form cycle, it would be identical, except that the value of the years would be increased to measure eons, for there is no difference, it seems, except magnitude in the scope of the individual and the scope of the species. So he's saying here, if you took this graph and you mapped for an individual person their survival instinct, and then if you took the same graph and you graphed it for all of humanity, the graph would be identical, except that instead of looking at, 70 to 100 years, you'd be looking at 7,000 years or whatever. So now he's going to talk about zones in the graph. And this is just sort of a way that he's sort of divided. When we talk about death versus survival, he's trying to give these things a number so that we can quantify them. And I think this is purely to make it look scientific and to keep this from just looking completely speculative as it actually is. But here we go. So the zones then can apply to two things, the physical being and the mental being. Therefore, these 4 zones can be called zones of the states of being. If a person is happy mentally, the survival level can be placed in zone 4. So zone 4 is happy. If the person is extremely ill physically, he might be plotted on estimated of his illness and in zone 1 or close to death. So the lower the zone, the closer you are to death. The higher the zone, the closer you are to happiness. And you're going from 0 to 4. It's kind of like a GPA here. So, if you're happy, you're getting an A. If you're about to die, you're getting an F. So, Very unprecise but nevertheless descriptive names have been assigned to these zones. Zone 3 is one of general happiness and well-being. Zone 2 is a level of bearable existence. Zone 1 is one of anger. Zone 0 is the zone of apathy. These zones can be used as a tone scale by which state of mind can be graded. Just above death, which is 0, would be the lowest mental apathy or lowest level of physical life, 0.1. A tone 1, where the body is fighting physical pain or illness, or where the being is fighting in anger, could be graded from 1.0, which would be resentment or hostility, through tone 1.5, which would be a screaming rage, to a 1.9, which would be merely quarrelsome inclination. From tone 2 to tone 3, there would be an increasing interest in existence, and so forth. So essentially, the higher you go, now he's, instead of calling it zones, now he's calling them tones. And my understanding is that the tone scale is something that's used quite a bit in Scientology, though I don't really know much more about it than what I've just read here. Maybe there's more later in the book, but yeah, my understanding is that this tone scale is kind of important. In Dianetics, we do not much employ the physical tone scale. The mental tone scale, however, is of vast and vital importance. And that's consistent because Dianetics is supposed to be about mental health. So we're not worrying about how your body is. We're worried about how your mind is, and we're going to put your mind on the tone scale somewhere between 0 and 4. And he says a norm in current society at a wild guess is probably around 2.8. So that's where he puts most people right now, or at least, in the late 40s. We're somewhere around a 2.8, which would, let me see, go back here, increasing interest in existence. So most people are seems to be generally okay. Like, high 2s is not bad, but I suppose in Dianetics, he's trying hard to get you to 4. So earlier he said that the driving force of survival is away from pain and towards pleasure, and he's going to elaborate on that a little bit here. A pleasure which reacts to injure the body physically, as in the case of debauchery, discovers at work a ratio between the physical effect, which is depressed towards pain, and the mental effect of experienced pleasure. There is a consequent lowering of the survival dynamic. So what he's saying here is that your physical dynamic and your mental dynamic can be in conflict, as is the case with debauchery. I'm assuming by debauchery here he's talking about something like alcoholism, where you get pleasure out of drinking, but it's actually harming you. So this is a sort of deceptive pleasure, I guess you could call it. Any action which has brought about survival suppression, or which can bring it about, when pursued as a pleasure, has been denounced at some time or another in man's history. I don't think he's wrong about that. And this I highlighted in a different color because I guess immorality is originally hung as a label upon some act or class of actions because they depress the level of the survival dynamic. Future enforcement of a moral stigma may depend largely on prejudice and aberration, and is therefore consequently a contentious quarrel over what is moral and what is immoral. So what he's saying here is that these, what you might call deceptive pleasures, these things that are pursued as pleasures but are actually harmful, are things which at various points in history have been called immoral. So again, you take the example of alcoholism. There certainly, today we regard alcoholism as an illness, which I think Hubbard would probably agree with, but in the past it's been seen as a character defect or some sort of flaw. And you could say the same thing about drugs or overindulgence in sex or whatever. But he's also saying that because of changing conditions, things that are moral or immoral can change, according to his definition, things which promote survival or degrade survival can change. And so the reason that we argue so much about morals is the fact that we may be clinging to old morals that don't necessarily apply. And again, using morals in this specific technical sense. When a race or individual drops into the second zone as marked on the chart, and the general tone ranges from the first zone barely into the third, a condition of insanity ensues. Insanity is irrationality. It is also a state in which non-survival has been so closely approached continually that the race or organism engages in all manner of wild solutions. So, first of all, I want to take issue with the idea that insanity is irrationality, because I think that's putting way too much faith in rationality. I believe that people operate rationally, more or less. And I say that because I have a background in economics, where rationality is assumed at the basis of economic decisions. Now, a lot of people argue with that because they say people are not rational, people don't make rational decisions, and that's, psychology has kind of pretty much established that, and I would agree with that. But in economics, we say it doesn't matter if people are actually rational or not, provided that they behave as if they were. And if you look at the economic decisions that people make, in general, they are. Obviously, this could be done correctly or incorrectly, but that's my take on rationality. I don't think it's the same thing as sanity. I think sanity is just a condition of understanding the world in the same way in which most other people understand the world. And when I say understand the world, I mean that in the most general sense possible. Moving on. The balance and nature of things do not permit the infinity of the goal of immortality to be reached. So basically what he's saying here is that immortality is not possible. We are finite beings, and so the nature of things do not permit this goal to be reached, but we still do strive for it. Now, my understanding here is that this particular sentence is a big difference between just Dianetics and Scientology, because I believe in Scientology, humans are regarded as immortal spiritual beings. So it seems that Hubbard may have changed his mind about that. The dynamic of any life form can be seen to be assisted by many other dynamics and combines with them against the suppressive factors. None survive alone. I'm not sure why I highlighted that, to be honest with you. I think he talks about symbiotes later on, and I think that's kind of what he's hinting at here, that your survival is dependent on the survival of other people and things, and so all of our dynamics interact. I think he's elaborating a little on that here. It chances to be a scientific fact, again, the whole scientific fact thing, that man is a self-determined organism to the outermost limit of any form of life can be, for he still depends on other forms of life and his general environment, but he is self-determined. This is a matter which will be covered later, but right here it is necessary to indicate that he is not inherently a determined organism in the sense that he is driven on this wonderful stimulus-response basis which looks so neat in certain textbooks and works so completely unworkable in the world of man. The happy little illustrations about rats do not serve when we are talking about man. The more complex the organism, the less reliably these stimulus-response equations work, and when one reaches the highest level of complexity, man, he has reached a fine degree of variability in terms of stimulus response. The more sentient, the more rational an organism, the more that organism is self-determined. Self-determinism, like all things, is relative. Compared to a rat, however, man is very self-determined indeed. This is only a scientific fact because it can be easily proven. there's still the appeal to scientific facts here, but this appears to be sort of a jab at the behaviorist school of psychology, saying that the stimulus response thing looks good when you're talking about rats. You give them the lever to press to get food, and they press it and get food. And once they learn they can get food by pressing it, they press it a lot. And he's saying people are too complex for that. Now, on some level, I agree with that, but on another level, I don't. People definitely respond to stimuli, and they definitely respond to incentives. So it may not be the most obvious if A then B kind of thing, but I think it definitely exists, and I think that particular paragraph is just really like pushing against it too much. It is understood that the more aberrated a person is, the closer he approaches the intelligence quotient of an animal. That's an interesting one, because remember, aberrated means unhealthy, and in this particular context, mentally unhealthy. And so he's saying that a mentally ill person is closer in intelligence to an animal. And by intelligence, he means rationality. So it's a little convoluted, but I also think he's wrong. I also think you can be mentally ill, but still be very, very smart. I don't think Ted Bundy is as smart as he's sometimes made out to be, but he's not a dumb guy, or he wasn't a dumb guy. Like if you watch the interviews with him, he's articulate, he understands what he's saying, he understands the implications of some of what he's saying. He refuses to say certain things because he knows about certain implications. He's not stupid, he's mentally ill and evil, but that's a whole other thing. The creative, the constructive, the beautiful, the harmonious, the adventurous, and yes, even escape from the maw of oblivion. These things are pleasure, and these things are necessary. So this is his idea of what real survival entails. That in order to get yourself to a 4, you're looking at creativity, beauty, harmony, adventure. So there you go. Man, in affinity with man, survives, and that survival is pleasure. It's a pretty philosophical view of pleasure, but I don't think it's entirely wrong, and I don't think it's not a super new idea. I mean, going back many, many years, but I'm thinking back to a college philosophy class where I want to think that in Plato, they started from that principle that good is pleasure and evil is pain, and worked that up into a more complete philosophy. So I think he's kind of building on that here, although he's not crediting it. He's making it sound like this is something that he discovered. But in any case, it's I don't think he's completely wrong. So, let us look at the 4 dynamics. So we've seen the 4 dynamics before. We saw them in the synopsis. But we're going to go into a little more detail about them here. So, we know that the bedrock principle of existence is survival. Survival in personal terms was computed until the whole activity of man could be theoretically explained in terms of self alone. The logic looked fairly valid, but then it was applied to the world. Something was wrong. It did not solve problems. In fact, the theory of survival in personal terms alone was so unworkable that it left the majority of behavior phenomena unexplained. but it could be computed and still looked good. Again, there's some data I'd really like to see, because he's talking now about an experiment that failed, right? And often experiments that fail are as instructive or more instructive than experiments that succeed. And so that's something that would be good to know about. Then it was that a nearly intuitive idea occurred. Man's understanding developed in ratio to his recognition of his brotherhood with the universe. That was high flown, but it yielded results. In brotherhood with the universe, and the universe is capitalized there. So I'm not sure what he's quite getting at. When this was applied to observed data, again, it failed to explain every phenomenon. Okay. A new computation was made on the survival dynamic. Exactly for what was man surviving? All four of these factors, self, sex, group, and mankind, were entered into a new equation, and now it was found a theory was in hand which worked. It explained all observed phenomena and predicted new phenomena which were discovered to exist. It was a scientific equation, therefore. So, another thing that kind of bothers me about Hubbard's claims to science is this reference to equations. Because I'm not sure if he's talking about literal equations in the mathematical sense, or if he's talking about, some sort of abstract idea of an equation where, we kind of think about things on one hand and another hand, and they kind of balance out, and that's an equation. So I'm not sure how he means the word equation. But generally speaking, what we're getting here is the idea that when he tried his ideas on the single dynamic of individual survival, it didn't work. So he had to think about it a new way. And that's what he's talking about here. And so we come up with the four dynamics, which we will take a look at. Dynamic 1 is the urge towards ultimate survival on the part of the individual and for himself. It includes his immediate symbiotes, the extension of culture for his own benefit, and name immortality. I'm not sure what in name immortality I think he means people will know about you after you die or something. I'm not sure. I'm not sure if that's what he means by name immortality or what. He also says it includes his immediate symbiotes, and a symbiote is another organism that helps you to survive. So I'm sure he has something specific in mind here, but I think you could think of your symbiotes as maybe your kids or your partner or something. I'm not exactly sure what he was thinking when he said that. But let's move on. Dynamic 2 is the urge of the individual towards ultimate survival via the sex act, the creation and the rearing of children. It includes their symbiotes, the extension of culture for them, and their future provision. So dynamic 1 is the self. Dynamic 2 is the bloodline. It's your kids. Dynamic 3 is the urge of the individual toward ultimate survival for the group. It includes the symbiotes of the group and the extension of its culture. So he doesn't really define what the group is here, but it could be a country, it could be a race, it could be a smaller group within a country, it could be a religious group. I think he is implying here that it could be any group. But I think he is thinking mostly in terms of like one's immediate community and one's, I want to say race. That's a more loaded term now than it was 70 years ago. So I think he is talking about race here, but I'm not necessarily sure that he's talking about it in an us versus them sort of way. Dynamic 4 includes the urge of the individual towards the ultimate survival for mankind. It includes the symbiotes of mankind and the extension of its culture. I think that one's pretty self-explanatory. So we have this set of dynamics that starts with the individual and then extends out towards all of mankind generally. Now, as I understand it, in Scientology, there are actually 8 dynamics. So that's another thing that changed between Dianetics and Scientology. None of these dynamics is necessarily stronger than any of the others. Each is strong. They are the 4 roads that a man takes to survival. And the 4 roads are actually one road. And the one road is actually a spectrum of thousands of roads contained within the 4. They are all in terms of past, present, future, and the present day may be a sum of the past, and the future may be a product of the past and the present. That is a really convoluted and completely unnecessary paragraph. What he's saying here is that these dynamics encompass a lot of activities. The 4 roads, the 4 dynamics are actually one dynamic. It's survival, but it's survival in a myriad of aspects. And the way that we pursue survival is diverse. That's all he's really saying there, and it's so obvious as to be unnecessary. Now, it happens that these 4 dynamics can be seen to compete with one another in their operation within an individual or society. There is a rational reason for this. The phrase social competition is a compound of aberrated behavior and sentient difficulties. Any man, group, or race may be in contest with any race, group, or man, and even in contest with sex on an entirely rational level. The equation of the optimum solution would be that a problem had been well resolved, which portends the maximum good for the maximum number of dynamics. That sounds like a pure utilitarian idea, the greatest good for the greatest number. I don't think it's entirely that, but what he's saying is, I think, that there may be competition on an individual level, or on a group level, or on a worldwide level, but this competition is the result of aberration. That if we were all clear and unaberrated, there would be total harmony. I think that's what he's saying. I'm not 100% sure. Maybe he'll talk more about it later. There are special cases where the equation of the optimum solution becomes so involved with time that certain dynamics must be neglected to permit other dynamics to persist. The case of a sailor giving his own life to save the ship answers the group dynamic. Such an action is a valid solution to a problem, but it violates the optimum solution because it did not answer for dynamic 1, the self. So, in this case, the optimum solution is that everybody survives. The second most optimum solution is that one man sacrifices himself to save everybody else. He's a little unclear here because he's saying that the optimum solution, there are times when the optimum solution must neglect certain dynamics, but then he says it's a violation of the optimum solution to neglect a certain dynamic. What I think he means is that there are occasionally times when a suboptimal solution is the only solution. And that you can call it optimal if it gets as close to the ideal optimal as possible, even though it may not completely get there. And that's it for chapter 4. And so now we're on to the summary. And the summary is pretty much everything we've talked about in the last two episodes. He's just going through the fundamental axiom is to survive. We go through the dynamics. But this part is kind of interesting here. The dynamic is the tenacity to life and vigor and persistence in survival. Both the dynamic and intelligence are necessary to persist and accomplish, and neither is a constant quantity from individual to individual or group to group. The dynamics, this is a pretty key part right here. The dynamics are inhibited by engrams, which lie across them and disperse life force. Intelligence is inhibited by engrams, which feed false or improperly graded data into the analyzer. Happiness is the overcoming of not unknown obstacles towards a known goal, and transiently the contemplation of or indulgence in pleasure. The analytical mind is that portion of the mind which perceives and retains experienced data to compose and resolve problems and direct the organism along the four dynamics. It thinks in differences and similarities. The reactive mind is that portion of the mind which files and retains physical pain and painful emotion and seeks to direct the organism solely on a stimulus-response basis. It thinks only in identities. The somatic mind is that mind which, directed by the analytical or reactive mind, places solutions into effect on the physical level. So we're actually looking at three quote-unquote minds here. So the analytical mind is the thinking part of the mind. It's the rational part of the mind. You have a dilemma. You need to resolve it. You are motivated to move along a dynamic because doing so is pleasure and moves you away from pain. This is compromised, however, by the reactive mind, which stores pain and seeks only to direct you away from pain. So if there's an optimal solution to a problem which might temporarily take you towards pain, the reactive mind is going to push you away from that and push you away from the optimal solution. The result of this operation is fed into the somatic mind, which is the part of the mind that translates thoughts into actions. Habit is a stimulus-response reaction dictated by the reactive mind from the content of engrams put into effect by the somatic mind. It can be changed only by those things which change engrams. And he's starting to point to Dianetic therapy here. But he's saying that habit is just something that your reactive mind pushes you into behavior patterns, and then you'll tend to hold on to those behavior patterns. Oh, hey, we get the actual equation. The potential value of an individual or a group may be expressed by the equation PV equals ID, where I is intelligence and D is dynamic. So we get an equation with variables that are impossible to define. How do you define the value of a person? How do you define the intelligence of a person? How do you measure a dynamic? I would really love to know the answer to these questions. I'm thinking that for dynamic, he's going to use the tone scale. I don't know what he's going to do with intelligence, and I don't know how he's going to calculate personal value or potential value, but I also have a feeling that we're not going to get too much detailed talk about this equation. I'm actually hoping to be proven wrong about that, because this is the first tangible thing that we've got that we can look at and say, all right, here's what he's thinking. Let's actually work through it with him and see if we reach the same conclusion. But by making these variables so abstract, I have a feeling that he's going to be able to say whatever he wants to say about them without needing to appeal to actual science, without having to show us any data, without having to define how he's reaching the numbers that he's reaching, if he is indeed actually even reaching numbers and not just talking in the abstract about these things. But in any case, this is the end of part 1 of the book. As we see, if we go down to the next page, we're looking at book 2, the single source of all inorganic, mental, and organic psychosomatic ills. So he's going to talk about that in book 2. So that's what's coming next. So this book 1 here has given us the basis here. So he's laid out what he's talking about, and I will say that organizationally, so far, what I've seen isn't bad. Like I said, I like the fact that he gives you a topic paragraph at the start of each chapter. He is laying out what he believes are the first principles here. So he's talking about, the dynamic principle of survival and the principles of the various types of dynamics and the reactive mind and that stuff. So he's given us a good background from which to jump off into what he believes Dianetics will actually do for you. So I like that aspect of the book. As usual, I am continually irritated with, this is a scientific fact, but not giving us anything other than his word that that's true. Is it a scientific fact? Is it really? Because scientific facts generally have research to back them up. And, well, he talks a lot about research. He doesn't actually show us any. We don't see any numbers. We don't see any data. We don't see any descriptions of experiments or anything like that. So we're getting a lot of pretense to science, but not any actual science. So I will say from that point of view, I'm not liking it. I am liking it from the point of view of how it's organized. I am not liking the writing style. I think it's overly convoluted. I think there are a lot of places where he could just write a plain old English sentence, but he has to find some way to make it a little torturous. Again, I don't know if this is something that was common in the late 40s. I've read some of the science fiction from around that period, stuff like Heinlein and Sturgeon, who were writing around then, and I don't recall them being quite so convoluted. It's been a long time since I've read anything by Hubbard, other than this. I did read Battlefield Earth once, probably sometime in the late 80s. And I'm pretty sure I read his short story, The Typewriter in the Sky, because it's kind of a classic. And I don't remember the language being overly complicated then. I would have been a lot younger, so I probably would have had even more trouble with the language back then if it had been bad. But I think the reason for the over-convolutedness of the language here is just simply that he's trying to sound scientific. And he uses a lot of the tropes of scientific writing, like the passive voice. You see this a lot in scientific writing, and you see this all over the place in what we've just read. There's a lot of, it was discovered, it has been determined, it could be said, not a lot of I discovered, I determined, the experiment showed. So take that for what it's worth. But I'm going to end it here. Next time we will be digging into the first part of book 2. Don't know how many chapters I will cover because I haven't looked at them yet. If they're super long and involved, I may have to go one at a time. I'm going to try and keep up at least 2 per episode if I can, but we'll see how it goes. Anyway, I hope you're all enjoying the series. I hope this is as enlightening for at least some of you as it has been for me. This is something that I've always been kind of curious about, and I'm enjoying going through it, even if I'm not always enjoying hacking my way through the thicket of grammar that Hubbard seems to like to throw up for us. But in any event, I will catch you all in the next one, and I will talk to you real soon. Graham out. Bye-bye.